NSFW, what is the most disturbing history fact you know? In 1237, Genghis Khan's third son, Al-Jadid, ordered the arpay of 4,000 Werat girls above the age of 7 in front of their relatives. Afterwards some were sent to the royal harem and others were turned into prostitutes. Probably something more disturbing, but this is the first thing that came to mind. There was a woman in the 1700s who, after a miscarriage, went into labor and delivered a dead cat and several live baby rabbits. After a lengthy investigation, English royals discovered that this woman put the animals inside her cervix, which was still open from the miscarriage, when no one was looking, to give the appearance that she was giving birth to them. Blanche Monnier was a French woman who was being kept prisoner in a small dark room by her own mother. She was kept there secluded for 25 years, and when the police discovered her, she was surrounded by filth. A photograph of her was taken shortly after she was discovered in her room, and the look in her face is haunting. Athanasios Diarchus, a Greek history hero, was impaled from his butthole through his mouth alive. Vlad the Impaler did that to a lot of people. It would take days for people to die, and he would sit and eat his food next to people while they suffered. Heart monitors worn on the Challenger's space shuttle show that the crew wasn't killed instantly, but actually survived for a while. I like to think they weren't conscious for any of it, but they probably suffered horribly for some time. There is a Neolithic mass grave in Germany of 26 young children and men with a high number of injuries on their legs. They were intentionally crippled before they were killed by arrows and blunt force. The systematic and deliberate way the victims' lower bones were broken indicate torture. The group missing girls and women also means they were most likely abducted. Warfare 7,000 years ago. French medical mystery terror, the one most famously known for allegedly eating a baby, was autopsied after his death. The autopsy revealed that his gullet was so wide that when his mouth was opened, one could see directly into his stomach. His entire body was full of pus and his stomach filled most of the space in his abdominal cavity save for what was taken up by his abnormally large liver and gallbladder. The scent of his body was said to be fouler than rotting offal. In the 1800s, a woman named Madame Marie Delphine Lalaurie did some really horrific things to slaves she owned at the time, including cutting off their genitals and sewing them shut in the mouths of still living victims and similar things. I think she only got found out when a cook intentionally set the house on fire hoping to kill everyone inside because death was better than what was happening to them inside that house. Great War. Year 1915. In Polish fortress in Osawik, at that time under control of Russian Tsar, took place in Living Dead Counter-Strike. This was Germany's third assault on the fortress. This time they used gas that was a mix of chlorine and bromine, as they knew the Russians did not have proper protection. After the gas attack, Germans marched towards the fortress. But they did not expect the bayonet charge of burned, spitting blood and parts of their lungs Russians. The view surely was terrifying as 7,000 German soldiers fell back, driven away by 100 Russian survivors. After the Nazis, concentration camps were liberated. Everything you need to know about the history of warfare is boiled down to a Walt Whitman quote. War is 999 parts diarrhea and 1 part glory. Statistically, most people in non-modern warfare were more likely to die shitting themselves to death than dying some glorious heroic death. Kellogg created cornflakes so people would be too bored to emsturbert. Seriously. He thought anything with flavor would cause excitement and make you emsturbert. The cornflakes you eat now are sweeter than what they used to be. He also advised people to put carbolic acid on little girls' nether regions so they could never derive pleasure from emsturbation sex. Among other crazy things. He was nuts. The heir to the Jameson whiskey fortune fed a 12-year-old to cannibals. During World War II, the Japanese convinced an entire village of people to commit mass suicide, telling them the Americans were gonna pay and murder all of them once the village fell into their hands. That Herney VIE employed the groom of the stool to help him go to the toilet. It was a highly coveted position by his courtiers as it got you alone time with the king to bend his ear as well as wipe his ass. Anyway, there was one instance where after the by now extremely overweight king had been constipated for weeks, the groom of the stool was happy to report to the king's physician that the king has had a mighty fair siege. One can only imagine the horror of that mud out. It is believed during the 16th and 17th century, one way you can be punished for your crime is rat torture. What would happen is a person will be put laying down on a table with no shirts on with maybe 2 or 3 rats in a cage on your stomach. On top of the cage would be a bowl that would be filled with hot coal that would burn you and make it too hot for the rats. Due to being in a cage, there was no way for the rats to escape the heat of the coal, so the rats would burrow into the person's stomach. Historians are unsure if this punishment was until the rats got to a certain depth or the death of the victim. Benito Mussolini was violently beaten, shot, and hung on a hook along with his wife after his death. It was very gross and disturbing. But he had it coming. And now you can debate his granddaughter on Twitter. Counterfeiters in medieval Russia were punished by having their coins melted and the molten metal poured down their throats. Let me tell you about a wonderful torture method called scaphism. In ancient Persia, a prisoner is force-fed honey and milk, while also coating their body with them, particularly to the genitals and the anus. They are then fastened naked on a hollow tree trunk, with only their face and limbs exposed, and placed on stagnant water. They then would proceed to piss and tea out all those sweets vouchsafed to them, at which point the bugs are attracted to them. These insects would proceed to sting, bite and tear through their skin and burrow in their anus as they lay there covered in urine and feces. And no, they cannot die from starvation nor dehydration, cause they'll continue feeding them until they succumb to infection. Tangier, Morocco, 18th century. People used to try their newly acquired muskets in the Tawaga slave soldiers posted at south of the city. After a major rebellion against the British Company rule in India, the Brits retaliated by strapping Indians to the front end of cannons and firing. A couple years later the Raj was founded. I can't think of a more punishment that blends cruelty and visibility any further. That Henry Hudson's crew mutinied and set him, his teenage son, and 7 others adrift in a small boat in the Hudson Bay. They were never seen again. Mary Turner. Her husband was tortured and lynched by a mob of white folks looking for somebody else. When she spoke out against it, 9 months pregnant mind you, they beat her, hung her by her ankles, covered her in gasoline, set her on fire, and while she was still alive they gutted her like a pig and her screaming baby fell out of her torso. The crowd stomped it to death. This was 1918. Caligula hired a slave called a glutton who would eat anything, even kill humans and eat them for entertainment. This was done during feasts. Victorians ate mummies. In my country, last military takeover the government. As some of you might know, King Louis XIV of France moved the aristocracy to the castle of Versailles to be able to control them better. There were daily banquets, which lasted for hours. The only problem was that Louis XIV had severe diarrhea, so he needed to wear huge diapers to be able to sit for hours. The other attendants were forbidden to leave before the king, so they all sat in a brewing cloud of feckles. The Belgian Congo. Everyone thinks Belgians are just knockoff French or Dutch, but those moffas did some brutal stuff when they colonized, like hacking off limbs as punishment. Queen Victoria instituted a system of certifying prostitutes as syphilis-free. They were called the Queen's Ladies of the Night. Many prostitutes hung the certificate above their beds as a point of pride. The man who invented the iron bull was the first person it was tested on. This is just for me. I love NSFW history facts. The ancient Egyptians believed that there was a single channel connecting between the female's mouth and her vagina, with the uterus right in the middle. If a woman wanted to know if she could get pregnant, she would shove a whole onion up her vagina and wait for a day. If her breath smelled like onions on the next day, would have meant that she couldn't get pregnant. because she has a puncture in her uterus. Which is how the scent got past the uterus and made her breath smell like an onion. I'm not sure how true that is since the Egyptians knew a lot about human anatomy. I wouldn't call it the most disturbing history fact out there, but the existence of Camp 1391 comes to mind. It's a prison in Israel for high-risk inmates that we didn't know existed until 2003 because it was airbrushed off modern-day maps and aerial images. And we likely would have never found out about it if a historian wasn't reviewing old maps from the 1940s. Anything from the reports of Unit 731. That's just pure evil. Especially considering the people responsible were pardoned by the US. Pretty much any medieval torture device and how it was used and for what crime. Did you pay someone? Well, we'll put your dong in a cage filled with razors so it slowly cuts apart as you move. Your wife cheat on you? Well, you get to choice. Slowly lower her onto a sawhorse with a hot blade until her own weight splits her apart at the crotch, or shove a metal bulb into her womb and slowly expand it until she's torn apart. The latter was also used on men who committed sodomy. Medieval torture was effed up. My boarding school holds a lot of history. It's a Native American boarding school. And we were told what happened here by staff and guards. There are hundreds of unmarked graves from young children who were beaten, raped, and froze back in the 1800s and early 1900s. My older brother mentioned how the area across from our school used to be the original campus. And there are even more graves over there. He told me how kids would run away from the school and be found the next morning frozen. Of course, a lot of that could be untrue or more disturbing events occurred here. But all I know is that there is a lot of bad energy here on campus and throughout the town. But I'm glad we're past that and living happily here. I hope we're helping the spirits live peacefully knowing that we're still here. Still thriving. And still remember everything the government tried to make us forget. Mark David Chapman tried to commit suicide in 1977 by carbon monoxide poisoning. He was not successful and enters a hospital for treatment for depression. He kills John Lennon 3 years later. The horse. Mao Zedong killed more people than Hitler and Stalin combined. Hitler killed 10 mil. Stalin killed 20 mil. Ancient forms of torture. Breaking on the wheel. Skin peeled off with red hot pincers. The bronze bull. The worst one. Imo. Was scaphism. Also referred to as the boats. The victim would be trapped between two boats. Then would be force-fed milk and honey. As well as covered in said milk and honey. The victim would soil themselves after eating nothing but milk and honey. And being out in the sun covered in sour milk and honey would attract insects and vermin. If the infection from stewing in your own diarrhea didn't get you, being eaten alive by bugs would. Who comes up with that as something to do to another human being? Not to mention the amount of sustained effort in order to keep it up. Why did I think opening this post while eating was a good idea? Pocahontas was like 12 when she was taken and married, something like that. I can be very wrong. She was actually 10 and the dude was like 29. The Children's Crusade. See, that sounds adorable. The execution of the Romanov family was an extremely occurrence considering how fairy tale-esque the movie Anastasia was. Apparently in the 60s there was a thing that women were strapped to during labor and they were spun around until a baby came out. People used to use tickling as a torture method. Semicolon. Semicolon. Edit. Alexander the Great made his soldiers gay so when their husband died they would fight harder. How TF did he make them gay? You may be talking about the Theban Sacred Band. But I think you have a few details mixed up. The Sacred Band was an actual unit in the army of the ancient Greek city-state of Thebes, north of Athens. It was indeed composed of homosexual lovers, all men, because this bond of loyalty was hoped to create a unit who would not rout and would fight harder than their other troops. And for the most part, they were damn good at what they did, even defeating the Spartans. However, Alexander had nothing to do with their creation. In fact, they were long gone before his reign. Alexander's father, Philip II famously slaughtered the sacred band to the last man at the Battle of Chaeronea during his wars to unite Greece. The Macedonian army of Philip II and Alexander came with a great variety of advancements in military tactics and tech which, for the most part, outclassed the armies of southern Greece. Hitler has one ball and still has a girlfriend. Nanking Massacre. There are nude photos existing of exactly one First Lady of the United States. Two First Ladies. Jackie O and Melania. In World War II, Hitler selected 200 Jews and had them specially executed. After they died, they were skinned and stripped of all fat. He extracted the oils from all the skins and mixed them with the fat and some other binding agents to make soap for him and his highest generals. He made soap out of people. While I'm not exactly shocked by this, I'd be curious to see documentation. I'd think that to the Nazi mind, washing with Jew soap would be like a normal person washing with soap made from human shit or vermin corpses. Citation needed. They didn't used to use anesthetic on babies up until the 80s. They thought babies didn't feel pain, and since they fall asleep sometimes when they get hurt, circumcision etc. I think it's just a baby's body's response to pain when they can't get away from it. It's terrifying to think about. Hitler wanted to tuck his niece real bad. She shot herself to prevent this, and the Nazi propaganda machine covered it up by pretending it was an accident. Also, the surveillance state of East Germany, particularly in East Berlin. Epstein didn't kill himself. West wouldn't have done anything to prevent World War II if Germany wouldn't have attacked Poland. During World War II too, in the Japanese prisoner of war camps that held American soldiers, short 5 feet 1, 5 feet 2 Japanese soldiers would stand on boxes to hit the tall American soldiers. The whole Jonestown thing. I just found out about it last week and can't stop researching. It's insane. I live in the area in N.C.A. He and the cult lived in right before they went to Guyana. I know many people who lost family in Guyana. We can always tell if someone has moved here rather than raised here if they use the phrase drink the Kool-Aid. You never say it here, as you may be saying it to someone whose family member may have actually drank the Kool-Aid and died. The Habsburg Empire no longer exists. Look, I know Internet Explorer was slow, but geez. Genghis Khan arped so many people that 1 in 200 people today are directly related to him. Not how it happened. Genghis Khan and those carrying his Y chromosome held positions of wealth and authority such that they had many generations with large numbers of children who survived at much higher rates than the general population. When they mummify people. US allowed Pakistan to genocide innocent Bengalis and threatened India with nuclear weapons because it started taking actions to prevent the Holocaust-like event in the Pakistan-occupied East Bengal, now known as Bangladesh. TLDR. Nixon is the reason behind South Asia's nuclear arsenal. In World War I, the Germans would deploy an odorless, tasteless gas that would make people vomit.